You gonna change or I'm gonna leave. You gonna change your way of living, change the things you do, stop doing all the things that you oughtn't to. Your daddy's mad, he's done got peace. You gonna change or I'm gonna leave.
Hello and welcome to this episode 6 of the For All That podcast, which discusses the latest affairs in Scottish and UK politics. Joining us today, we've got a couple of guests. First is Philip Challinor, who is a blogger and a self-published novelist. Thank you for coming on, Philip.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Peter Geoghegan, who is a freelance journalist. Some of you may have read his work in the Scotsman newspaper. Hello, Peter.
Hello there.
and also it's me, Andrew Tickell, as usual, and Michael Greenwell, kind of co-hosts of this podcast. How are you doing, Michael?
All right, Chiefs. I just wanted to say all right, Chiefs, because I've never heard that on a podcast before.
Okay, well, we may as well crack on with our very first story of the week, and as I'm sure you've all noticed, it's been Levenson mania as the Learned Lord delivered, or I should say the Learned Lord Justice, as he's not a lord, handed down his verdict on failures of the press and made recommendations for the regulation of the press in the UK as a whole. It's obviously caused a great degree of controversy. I don't know what anybody thought about. First reactions. First, I'll start with you, Peter.
I must confess, I have not been the closest reader, obviously, the report. How many volumes is it? 4 volumes? You've only got volume 1 so far. Am I right on that?
Slightly shorter than Harry Potter, I hear.
But without the more wizardry in it, I expect.
Maybe there's a little bit of wizardry in there somewhere. But so I must confess, I'm aware of its arrival, and I've been meaning to kind of peruse it. But I guess heuristically, using if you use who's for something and who's against it as a measure of whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, I think it's been quite interesting to see the forces that have lined up quite firmly against Lord Levenson's proposals. There seems to be the Daily Mail, the Sun, and some other kind of papers of that ilk. So maybe, I don't know, heuristically, that might tell me something about where the debate is at.
Do you mean in terms of one's enemies? If your enemies get behind something, then perhaps you sort of feel that immediate impulse reflexively to take another tack. Which is kind of a worrying pulse. And that seems to be, quite a feature actually of the political debate. I mean, Philip, you live down in London. I don't know what perspectives you had on this, and sort of from a more UK political perspective, perhaps.
Oh, God forbid. Yes, I've noticed that, all the best people are against it, aren't they? Cameron said before it came out that he'd implement it as long as it wasn't loony, and he's now decided that a small degree of regulation backed by the law is, in fact, loony. It's given Nick Clegg a backbone, which is quite an achievement. He seems to be lining up with Labour. I don't know how decisive they'll be when it comes to the crunch.
Okay, so maybe if we can focus in on one curious aspect which struck me quite a lot this week was that before Levenson announced his findings, who popped up but Alex Salmond, First Minister, to sort of apparently bounce David Cameron into enacting some of these proposals. And one thing that really struck me about this is that if you follow what Alex Salmond has said about press regulation, what he said about the phone hacking scandal, since the scandal erupted, he's really betrayed very little interest in the topic. He's persistently given an impression that the great scandal was on Fleet Street and none of it really touched Scotland. I think he seemed quite content to see it as a scandal in the UK state and happy to, lob the old firecracker in. But not perhaps to take action himself. And one of the really interesting things this week is that he's made such a big thing about the fact that press regulation, in terms of the paper press, is a devolved power. It's not reserved under the Scotland Act. And so the SNP has had the power to act about this for the entire length of its governance in Scotland.
Could I add in there that also the previous Labour administrations also had the power to act to this, but didn't want to touch it for whatever reason?
Oh, I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, in the inactivity is general. There's no question about that. But it seems to me quite interesting that suddenly we have Alex Salmond making either flying a flag or possibly being serious-minded about wanting a distinct Scottish regulator. And obviously one of the things which strikes you about that politically is, with David Cameron seeming to back away from the Levenson proposals, that this gives Eck a chance to promote that kind of distinct Scottish agenda, as he would see it. I don't know how that struck either. Maybe you, Peter. You live in Edinburgh, don't you?
I do indeed, yes. Well, I guess that will be interesting to see if how the specific kind of Scottish agenda will come out. Or, well, I guess it depends. For me, it feels like one of these documents that people can read into what they want to read into it. And I guess that will be interesting to see. People will use it as a stick to either beat the press or beat in a specific jurisdiction, whether it's Scotland or the rest of the UK. And I think that will be the interesting thing that I will be looking at to see what it's used for, as much as what it's used against.
But I mean, how do you feel about the general proposition about the role of the state with respect to the press? Because we have obviously the comparisons are often made with the First Amendment to the US Constitution by those that like that kind of document, which forbids Congress from making any law abridging freedom of expression, freedom of the press. In this country, we obviously don't have an entrenched Bill of Rights or anything like it. We do have the European Convention on Human Rights, which is entrenched in the Human Rights Act, which protects freedom of expression, but it does so in a much, much more limited way than the American jurisprudence and case law equivalent was. So I wonder what you could think about that.
Well, the thing is with America, it's not like the press is as wonderfully free as they like to say. Like, John Pilger's fond of an anecdote, and I've heard him say it a few times, where in the Cold War period, between the saber rattling, there were moments where they tried to be friends with each other and they'd literally exchange programs. And 2 Russian journalists came over to America to see how a proper free media works. And at the end, they've been toured around, I think it was the Washington Post or some place like that. And they asked them what they thought of it, and they said, it's amazing. This is amazing. When we want to get this level of conformity from journalists, we have to send them to Siberia. How do you do it? And it's, in part, in Britain, it's the level of conformity comes from the lobby system. One of the things in the Levenson report was that politicians of all parties, he said, have developed too close a relationship with the press in a way that has not been in the public interest. And that's got to come through the lobby system.
Also, something he didn't touch on, apparently, is the issue of ownership. Most of the press in the UK is owned by, 40% of it is owned by Murdoch, or something like that. And the other interesting thing is that William Hague has just come out today, I read, saying that statutory...
He's just come out? Jesus.
Well, not quite.
No, I think there wasn't that scandal last year. Sorry.
Sorry, I just like to throw an occasional one in there. Sorry, you were saying.
Interesting question, actually, whether describing someone as a homosexual these days is in fact defamatory or not. Discuss. No. Sorry, anyway, Philip, you were saying.
Yes.
William Hague came out, yeah.
William Hague came out and said that any sort of statutory underpinning would undermine whatever constitution we've got and would be the end of the British state as a bastion of freedom and all the rest of it. While his colleague Theresa May is campaigning to introduce the Snoopers Charter to monitor everything that happens on the internet and by email and all the rest of it.
Gee, the rights of the freeborn Englishman extend only to members of the press lobby, while all of the average citizens rattling away on their machines are subject to Theresa May's unwilling attention to what they're up to.
Yeah, bloggers in their underwear and all the rest of it. She's after us.
I was interested in what you just said there, Michael, about this idea of the kind of groupthink and the way that the lobby, that's often something people would say about it. And I think also, in fairness, that makes sense sort of sociologically, that if you go into a room full of folk and everyone in the room is having this, is entertaining the same argument, talking to the same people, talking to each other, then it's quite common that I suppose people start aligning their perspectives. It was a point that was made, interestingly, I saw, about the American elections, and actually the way that Twitter was a medium for the convergence of analysis, perhaps rather pompous commentators who all followed each other, that they kind of generated a bit of a kind of groupthink around how the debates were going, say, what were the important topics to discuss. So it had a really important role for like agenda setting. I don't know, Peter, you are a freelance journalist. I wonder, what do you think about that phenomenon, just in general terms, and perhaps about this as well?
I think there is an element of groupthink that goes on with not just with politics, but a lot of news stories, I think. And there is, both are extreme caricatures of the reality of life on online life, really, and the discussion goes around. And I think that works both for kind of informed politicos and whatever you want to call it, lay people. But I do think there is a certain element of groupthink that goes on, partly not just motivated by Twitter, but also motivated by the media. If you look at the US election, is a useful a useful case in point, really. You had a very dry election run-up for quite a long time, where Mitt Romney had to kind of come out from a field, which he was always going to come out of a very, very unexpected Republican candidates, but some of them were exciting, but for the wrong reasons. And he was far behind Barack Obama in most runnings, and then there was always going to be a swing back in the media to pull Mitt Romney up, because otherwise there was no story. And that did become a certain amount of groupthink, I think, around the election. And that can become self-generating. Whether it has a huge effect on voters, I'm not quite as convinced. If you even look at return to the US election, Mitt Romney did lose by quite a sizable margin in the end. He quite aptly won 47% of it.
I think that these kind of things are quite interesting. I think prospectively, of course, going into the independence referendum about, well, how far does sort of narrative framing, how far does selection of topics, how does that impact on how people decide to vote and which ones sort of resonate with people? And obviously we do have a press in Scotland which is primarily unionist in character. I think that's not a partisan point to make. So it's interesting to sort of perhaps speculate about what these kind of narrative framing, what these groupthinks, what these collective suspicions in the press might actually materially affect in politics and society.
In the States, the impact seems to be that half of them don't vote.
Yeah,
well, the turnout in American elections is abysmal, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think you're right. It's about 50%. I think it ranges a bit, obviously, as you'd expect, between different constituencies and so on.
You'd wonder how much the correlation is between the two. I guess the people that are on Twitter talking about elections are going to be people that are interested in elections. But there is an opportunity in terms of political parties and political movements to set out a coherent message online, and that can be quite powerful if it is built up. I guess myself and Andrew, I know, have discussed this before, issues about public civility and quite how that works in the online age, or how it doesn't work. And I know it's kind of a recurring theme in terms of discussions on the independence referendum is kind of Twitter spats, etc., etc. And if it's used in that way to create a coherent message that does get kind of repeated across various mediums, it can be very powerful. If you look at some of these, I've just finished working on a story, and I guess I can talk about it because it won't be out. It's in tomorrow's paper on stuff around workfare and ATOS, and a lot of kind of community groups, people with disabilities, and these are people that would have found it hard to create kind of a group message and try and create links to one another without mediums like Twitter, and they have been quite successful at doing that and bringing it to the attention of the wider public. So in that respect, there is a real opportunity. If you have a cause or an issue you want to deal with, the internet and Twitter in particular has an opportunity to bring people together. Whether groupthink sets in, there's always a possibility, especially if you might people if you go down that line of following people that share your own opinions and your own beliefs, it is quite easy to think that you're always among the angels when sometimes you're not.
No, that's probably true. And thinking everyone agrees with you. I know that was the kind of topic which arose in last week's podcast. And maybe that is a nice point to segue on to maybe our second topic that we were going to have a wee chat about, which is the rise, as some people have characterised it, of UKIP. And UKIP strikes me as quite an interesting political outfit insofar as they are obviously dismal pessimists in terms of the British state. And speaking as a dismal pessimist myself, albeit in a rather different direction about the British state, I find that kind of interesting. But they rely, if you look at their rhetoric, if you look at the kind of the politics that they advance, it is very much of a sense that everything's gone to the dogs, that the country's in a state of sort of dismal collapse, and it's all of the kind of buzzwords of right-wing, disgruntled British nationalism, it seems to me. But it's getting a lot of traction in the press, this idea of the UKIP being on the rise, Nigel Farage making appearances again and again in the press, are doing quite well in some of these elections. Now, I wonder what any of you think of that. Maybe Michael, I'll go to you, being a bit quiet of late.
Well, first I think UKIP are the party that Mary Whitehouse would have voted for, because of what you're saying there about, the politics additionally, everything's got, the Victorian values thing again. At the same time, it's quite rapacious capitalism they're in favour of. But they make no impact in Scotland. It's one of those little differences that makes you proud, actually, that these people don't get anywhere in Scotland.
Yes, well, Peter, Philip. You are as the person based outside of Scotland primarily, although I'm in England too at the minute. We can hold you responsible for the rise of UKIP. I wonder, what do you think the factors are which make them more attractive? Well, what might explain a rise, if indeed it is a rise, among UKIP supporters, rather anti-Westminster rhetoric and so on? What do you think?
Well,
and you may not be a national UKIP voter yourself.
Well, no. I mean, this business of being the token imperialist is quite new to me, so you'll have to be patient. I suspect that it's a lot of it is just what you said about